All right, having identified the three main fingerprint patterns, we're now going to look at the minor dermatoglyphics, the minor fingerprint patterns. And in fact, there are actually four minor fingerprint patterns. Now, bearing in mind that the three main fingerprint patterns take up 85% of all the fingerprints that we can find anywhere in the world, the minor fingerprint patterns are clearly not that numerically common at all. But of the four types that there are, the most important one is probably the radial loop. And Galton classified this patterns where he counted this as the fourth most common pattern, and in fact it is the most frequently found pattern, the radial loop pattern. And the radial loop pattern is almost exactly the same as the ulnar loop, except for one reason. It goes in a completely different direction. So I'm giving you this example here because this is a handprint where we can see a regular ulnar loop on this finger here, and you can see the tri-radius just over there, like that, as we expect to see. And but in this hand, in this finger, we can see that the tri-radius is on this side of the hand, and the loop goes that way. So the distinctive thing about a radial loop is it opens from the radial side of the hand. The radial side of the hand is the thumb side of the hand. So this handprint that we're looking at here is the right hand. That's a right index finger with the loop opening to the thumb side of the hand. So normally you find ulnar loops. So ulnar loops start in the other direction. They come from the little finger side and they point towards the thumb. And this is a really important differentiation in terms of the fingerprint pattern. So we we notice that there are not just one type of loop, but there's actually two types of loop. But the difference is they go in different directions. So if you think of the motion of a fingerprint pattern, think of the loop like a wave. You can see that the wave is rising and crashing, and so the energy of that wave is going that way towards the inside, whereas the energy of these other fingers is going that way out towards the thumb and the external world that way. So the directionality of the loop is really, really important. And in terms of its psychological significance, certainly. But that's how you tell the difference between a radial loop and an ulnar loop is simply the direction between them. There's a loop formation. It has one triradius, but the directionality is completely different. Now, the thing about radial loops is they are really only found on the index finger. In fact, they're the third most common fingerprint pattern to be found on the index finger. And if we're going to find a radial loop in the hand, it's probably only going to be seen on the index finger because when it comes to the other fingers, it's actually incredibly rare to see the this pattern on the other fingers. Particularly, you never see it on the thumb or the little finger. I mean, I say never. You'd have to see lots and lots of hands before you're even going to find one. Um, but it's very, very rare to see a radial loop on an index finger, so on a little finger or on the thumb. The only place you commonly see the radial loop is on the index finger, and that's actually very significant too. Um, Sometimes you find it on the middle finger, but in my experience, that we don't see it often enough on that finger to be clear about its significance. On the ring finger, the radial loop, when it's found, it's unusual to find it on the ring finger, but it has been statistically noted to be more common in the hands of people with chromosomal disorders. So it's a very unusual pattern to see this pattern on any other finger other than the index finger. But when it's found on the index finger, it's actually incredibly common. There's no biologic reason given by any scientist that I've ever come across to explain why radial loops occur on this finger only and not really on the other ones at all. Um, Certainly, the volar pad theory doesn't really accommodate that notion, but it's nonetheless true that it is the third most common fingerprint pattern to be found on the index finger. So that's the radial loop. So the radial loop is different from the ulnar loop in the sense of the directionality in which the loop goes. So that's how you know the difference between an ulnar loop and a radial loop. A radial loop is open on the thumb side and is moving towards the little finger side, whereas A regular loop, the ulnar loop, starts on the little finger side and is pushing out towards the thumb. All right, so let's go to the next pattern then. The next pattern I want to talk about is the double loop, or sometimes called the twinned loop. On this particular handprint, we can see we have a regular loop here. And in addition to the regular loop on the middle finger, you can see that this hand also has two loops on the index finger. So there's a loop going up and a loop going down like that. So the double loop is exactly what it seems to be presenting, which is two loops going in two directions. And in most of the forensic books on fingerprint patterns, they talk about it as a twinned loop. And you get the sense of this pattern that it's actually two loops intertwining together. Um, it's relatively uncommon. It's only found on 3% of index fingers. But if you look at these examples here, you can see there's quite a lot of variations in the intensity of a double loop. Sometimes the loop is quite clearly apparent in a big swathing circle like that. And if you look carefully, you might consider that to be something like a yin-yang sign. There's a big double loop going through there. So the double loop basically is, if you think of it again as a wave, it's a bit like the wave crashing on the shore with an undertow coming around it. So look at this one on the right here. You can see the wave has kind of peaked, is crashing down. It's crashing down onto the shore in that way at the same time as the undertow is sort of pulling that energy that way underneath that. So that kind of thing is very descriptive of the kind of effects that a double loop has in someone's personality. And the double loop is actually really only commonly seen on the thumb, on about 13% of cases of the thumb. It's relatively rare on all the other digits. So again, like we saw with the radial loop, it does tend to be a kind of prioritization of particular patterns on particular fingers. And that's actually very significant, of course, from a psychological point of view. The next pattern we can look at is something called the central pocket whirl, or in palmistry, sometimes called the peacock's eye. I'm quite bemused at why it's called a peacock's eye, because if you actually look at the feathers of a peacock, they don't really look like that at all. But I think it comes from the Indian palmistry tradition, because of course peacocks are common in that country. But in the forensic system used by the FBI and the police systems around the world, this is called a central pocket whirl. And essentially, that's what it is. What you've got here is a whirl spiral going on in the middle of a pattern, but it's like it's encased within a loop. So there is a loop pattern there, and the loop pattern basically has got a little spiral in the middle of it. Um, and I think a good way to think about it um, is to think of it as a kind of a loop within inside a whirl. So if you take that pattern like that, you can see that there's a triradius here. And so that's like that would be like a sort of loop shaped pattern. But because it's got a second, because it's got a spirally shape in the middle, it has to have a second triradius here. And having a second triradius here means that this is essentially a whirl pattern. So again, that's our criteria. How do we know what kind of pattern it is? How many triradii are there? It's got two. The one on the left here, the triradius, and that will be over that side, slightly off the print there. And then you've got another triradius formation going on in this part of that part of the fingerprint there. So that's for all practical purposes, actually the best thing to do is to consider a central pocket whirl as a form of whirl. And if you look at those examples there, you can see that they look very whirlish indeed. Um, the the central pocket whirl is only common on the ring finger. Um, it's rare or extremely rare on the other digits. A little bit more common on the little finger, and almost never seen on the middle finger or the thumb. So it's a very rare pattern to see anywhere else other than the ring finger. But if you do see this pattern, then the best way to approach it is to consider it as to being a variant whirl, because all intents and purposes it functions like a whirl. The nature of the whirl is always to have this sort of spiraling intensity and focus. So people with lots of whirls have that kind of very focused, intense energy about them, like a tornado or a hurricane or a storm, where the energy is all focused into one particular spiral. So if you consider the central pocket whirl as a whirl, you'll be on the right tracks in terms of your understanding of it. Um, it's certainly closer to a whirl than to a loop in that case, in any case. All right, and that leads us on to the rarest fingerprint pattern of all, which is the fingerprint pattern that's called the tented arch. The tented arch um, again was defined by Galton quite clearly, but what we look at here, what we can see is we have the triradius, but the triradius is located in the center of the finger. It's not on the side of the finger, it's in the center of the finger. But that's not the important criteria. The important criteria for tented arch is not so much the location of the triradius, but that the fact that the ridges go up and go over. So what we have in a tented arch is we have no curving back. So the triradius doesn't curve back. Even in this example here, which as you can see is quite a high example of a triradius on this print, the ridges go up here and they go right over the top and they come back down again. So the spike can be quite high in the triradius in a tented arch, but the characteristic thing is that the ridges go right over and they don't come back on themselves on one side of that central thrust or the other. And that's what makes it a tented arch. It's called a tented arch simply because it's like the pole of a tent with a tent thrown over the top of the pole. That's the imagination of 19th century scientists for you. But it's not an arch because an arch has no triradius. So it's not an arch at all. So it should never be counted as a form of arch. And it's not a loop because it doesn't have a loop. It doesn't have the recurving ridges that makes it a loop. And that makes it extremely rare. And it's so rare that it's even uncommon on the index finger. Um, so here's some examples of tented arches. Again, we've got clear examples of this thrusting apex going up into the fingerprint like that, with the ridges going over the top. Sometimes that apex isn't particularly high, as you can see here, but what you've got there is a little triangle, which is why this is not an arch. It's kind of might be confused by an arch for some people. It's much easier to see when there is this distinctive thrust that's going up into the print like that. Um, and what's characteristic of all the things with the tented arch is there is no recurving of the ridges back on itself. So the tented arches, as I say, they're really uncommon on the index finger. Only about 4% of index fingers have a tented arch, but they're rarer on the other fingers. So rare that they are practically never seen on the little finger and non-existent on the thumb. It's impossible to say they don't exist at all, but the statistics are very clear that it's an incredibly rare pattern to be found on the thumb. So that's the outline of the minor fingerprint patterns. Um, if we consider them from percentage point of view, the radial loop is about 5% of hands. Fingerprint, sorry. The double loop is on about 4% of fingerprint patterns. The central pocket whirl about 3%, and the tented arch is only 1% of fingerprint patterns, and that's globally. These are quite widespread distributions. The distributions for the on a loop and the whirl and the arch. In this example, this is a sample from a UK population. So it's about 60% of fingerprints in the UK are on the loops, and about 20% are whirls, and about 8% are arches. But when you add all of those together, what you have is that it tells us is these seven fingerprint patterns make up 99% of all known fingerprints. So it becomes clear that this is a very comprehensive uh, classification system, that there are three major fingerprint patterns, the arch, the whirl, and the loop. And there are four minor fingerprint patterns, the radial loop, the double loop, the central pocket whirl, and the tented arch. And that, if you use that as a classification system and you're clear about how to identify all those patterns, then you'll be well on your way to understanding and seeing the significance of pretty much every fingerprint pattern that you're going to come across. 99% of all known fingerprint patterns are covered by these seven types. Um, so that's the bulk of the fingerprint patterns. As I said, most people will have loops, whirls, and arches, but you need to know about the other patterns because they do occur sufficiently commonly that you're going to be able to see them from time to time. So what about that one other 1%? That's what we'll look at next.